Okay, welcome to the re-recording of the shir that took place last night in Kehilas Ner Avram in beautiful Shari Chesed Yerushalayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted me to be able to do some chazorah because I accidentally pushed some little button on the microphone that caused it not to record. And indeed, there are going to be a couple of extra things here that I did not add in last night. So let's begin with a Ramban that already turns our picture of Yetzias Mitzrayim on its head. The Ramban speaks about Moshe Rabbeinu's status in Mitzrayim and Am Yisrael, and it says the following. Daber no ba'oznei ha'am. This is in Perek Yud, Pasuk Beis. Yud Aleph, Pasuk Beis. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu to please speak to the people, Vishalu ish me'Yisrael v'isha me'Yisrael uso klei kesef u'klei zov, and have them ask from their friends, their neighbors, meaning the Egyptians, right? And it's interesting using the word re'ehu here, for silver and gold vessels. Our first points out that here Vayishalu is not borrowing, but actually asking for them to be given. And then it tells us, Vayitein Hashem eschein ha'am be'inei Mitzrayim. In Pasuk Gimel, Hashem gave the favor of the nation in the eyes of the Egyptians. Gam ha'ish Moshe gadol ma'od be'eretz Mitzrayim. Also, Moshe Rabbeinu was very great in the land of Mitzrayim. Be'inei avdei Paro, in the eyes of the servants of Paro. U'be'inei ha'am, and in the eyes of the nation. So the Ramban comes to explain this pasuk in a way that is certainly not obvious when you're reading the Pshat. The Ramban says as following: Vayitein Hashem eschein ha'am be'inei Mitzrayim. Says the Ramban, Shelo hayu anshe Mitzrayim sonim osam al hamakos. He said that the citizens of Mitzrayim, the people of Mitzrayim, did not hate the Jews because they were the cause of them receiving the makos, the plagues. Avo mosifim bo'ehem ahava, but they actually, the process of the plagues caused them to love the Jews more. V'nosim chen beineim, and caused the Jews to find favor in their eyes more. How? Why? Leimor, the Egyptians said, Anachnu harashaim. We were wicked. We were the wrong ones. We were in the wrong. Gamosim chamos, and we were also violent. We also committed crimes against them. And it makes sense, it is befitting that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give you chen, should give you gifts, should give you favor. Gam ha'ish Moshe, and also, meaning even Moshe Rabbeinu, hamevi aleim hamakos. In other words, the Jew in the street perhaps wouldn't be identified as being the one who brought the makos, but Moshe Rabbeinu certainly was, very publicly warned them that the makkah is coming and delivered the makkah. Gadol ma'od b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. He was very great in all eretz Mitzrayim. Be'enei avdei Paro, in the eyes of the servants of Paro. V'anshe rivo, and these were people who were his enemies before. U'be'enei ha'am, Yisrael. And in the eyes of the nation, he says, this is not referring in the first parish to the nation of Mitzrayim, but the nation of Am Yisrael. Why was that necessary? Acharesha amrulo, because if we remember in Parshas Shmos that they came to Moshe Rabbeinu after he spoke to Paro and the Shibud, the conditions got worse. They said, Yera Hashem elechem v'yishpot. They said to Moshe and Aaron, let Hashem see and judge you. Right? And they weren't listening to Moshe anymore. The second time he came to them, it says, V'lo shamu Moshe mikotze ruach v'avora kosha. They had no patience and they were suffering. They couldn't. But now, nisgadel ma'od be'ineihem birosam ki nemon hu lenavi Hashem. Now it was clear to them that he was indeed a loyal prophet of Hashem, and that everything that happened was by Hashem's command and according to his prophecy. But there is another parish that says, Ki be'inei ha'am am Mitzrayim, that in the eyes of the nation is in the eyes of the Egyptians. So it was not just Avdei Paro, the ministers, but also Beinei Ha'am, the nation. It says, it does not tell us that he was great in the eyes of Paro, right? Because Hashem imetzes levovo, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu still hardened Paro's heart and had Paro speaking to Moshe improperly, right, a couple of times, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted that total defeat of Paro, and for Paro to come and to bow down before Moshe, as someone who's defeated has to bow down before the one he hates. All of this was part of the greatness which was to come to Moshe Rabbeinu. Now the Ramban negates another parish that you might have. He says, don't think that this is tied into the gifts that Am Yisrael asked the Egyptians to give, the vessels of gold and silver. He says, Lo yitachin nefarish ki v'yiten eschein ha'am be'enei Mitzrayim uchein ha'hashala. That the idea that Hashem gave favor, the Jews favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, meaning they gave them the gold and silver they requested. Says no, ki ata bizman ha'avtacha, because now when he's promising them that this is what's going to happen, lo yomar vayiten Hashem, right? He's telling them this is something you're supposed to do. You will go and you will ask from the Egyptians these things. It should say, va'ani etein eschein ha'am, I will give the favor of the Jews in the eyes of the people. Here it's telling us that this already was. Okay? So what's happening here is the following. We see that the Jews in Mitzrayim at this point were beloved. They were people who were looked up to. Their status had changed. And, as we'll see in a second, they were no longer enslaved physically. The Egyptians, in fact, were giving them gold and silver. The Egyptians admitted that the Jews were wrecked and that they had been wrong. This is what we find here. Now, the Ksav Sofer of Avraham Binyamin, there's one more name, Avraham Shmuel Binyamin Sofer, the son of the Chasam Sofer, who took over after his father as Rav of Preshburg and Rosh Yeshiva of the Preshburg Yeshiva, explains the following. He tells us, one moment. Sorry. Yes. So here on the same pasuk, the Ksav Sofer explains like this. He says, Ayin Ramban, look at that Ramban that he just mentioned. Va'nirli lefaresh, so what it seems to me to explain is, Ki hoya chen ha'am be'enei Mitzrayim, that the people found favor in the eyes of the Egyptians. Ki ascholas asino hoisa shechoshdu as Yisrael sheyasu imoim ra. We have to remember the brainwashing that Paro did. The Jewish people multiplied. And Paro said, if somebody comes to attack us, v'nosaf gam hu al sonenu, the Jewish people are going to be a fifth column. They are foreigners. They are going to turn on us, and they're going to help the invaders. Choshdu es Yisrael sheyasu imoim ra. So the Egyptians suspected the Jews of doing something to them which was very bad, right? And in fact, says the Ksav Sofer, if the Jews would have done such a thing, meaning after having found refuge in Mitzrayim, if they would have been a fifth column and turned against their Egyptian hosts, he said that would be a terrible midah. Mishal me'ra tachas tova. People who pay back goodness and kindness with evil. Now, he says this also is the parish of the Pasuk, where it says, Vayoreu osanu ha-Mitzrayim. That Vayoreu, a loshon of ra, of evil, means Shehayinu be'eineim ka'osei avlo kfuyei tova. We were in the eyes of the Egyptians of people who did something which was unjust and corrupt, as people who ignored and in fact paid back the good that was done to them with bad. Meaning it had never happened yet that the Jews became a fifth column and turned on the Egyptians. But Paro was able to sell that scenario so strongly that when an Egyptian saw a Jew, that was who he saw. But now, after Moshe Rabbeinu came and brought these makos upon Am Yisrael, and each time Paro told Moshe, I'm going to send them out. He's Palel Moshe Avuro. And then Moshe went and davened for Paro to take the makkah away from him and from the people. So now they saw that, wait a second, this is the opposite of what we expected. Came Tove Lev Rachmonim. If the Jews were these evil traitors that were plotting against us, if there was a makkah coming upon us, they would want it to continue and continue. Here Moshe Rabbeinu davened for mercy for them. So we saw that the Jews, not only were they not proactively treacherous to us, but even after all we've done to them, they didn't take advantage of their opportunity to get revenge. Suddenly now the Egyptians saw, right, that their suspicions of Am Yisrael were false. And now there was the turnaround. Suddenly the Jewish people were so valued, they found such favor in the eyes of the Mitzrayim. Now, it could have been that the Egyptians would have said, okay, this Moshe Rabbeinu, maybe just adding this in myself, he grew up as one of us, he grew up in Paro's palace, he was the one who davened to Hashem to stop the Makos. But really, the people of Am Yisrael, they wanted revenge. They wanted the Egyptians to suffer. And they disagreed with Moshe. Therefore, the Pasuk tells us, V'gam ha'ish Moshe gadol ma'od be'eretz Mitzrayim. Moshe Rabbeinu was great in Eretz Mitzrayim because of this kindness that he did, of saving them from the makos that Paro brought upon them with his refusals. Right? V'gam be'enei ha'am, and in the eyes of the Am, meaning in the eyes of Am Yisrael, as the Ramban said in that first Perush, meaning that they saw that the Jewish people also agreed with Moshe Rabbeinu davening to stop the makos on Mitzrayim. This was not something that they were against, this was something that they were for. And therefore, they found great favor in the eyes of the Egyptians. So let's stop for a second here before going on. What we see here is the following. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just add in one drop more from the Ksav Sofer. He says, as much as we explain this psychologically here, he says it's still miraculous that the turnaround should be they should find favor in the eyes of the Mitzrayim. That first they hated them and they enslaved them. And after the Makos, they were no longer enslaving them. Right? Because, number one, as soon as the Makos came, they were afraid. These were coming because of what they did to the Jews. Now, if they still hated the Jews and the Makos came, they would have chased them out of Egypt immediately because they weren't getting any benefit from them. They weren't working as slaves anymore. And they were suffering from the Makos. So Hashem gave the Chen Ha'am, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had them find favor in the eyes of the Egyptians. And in fact, the Egyptians had a hard time thinking of sending the Jews away now. They admired them so much. They wanted them to stay so much. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted this status to remain until he would finish the process of the Makos and send Makos Bechoros and then have Kriyas Yamsuf. All of that was according to plan. So it was a miraculous thing that was meant to be, to have this turnaround. Now let's pay attention here that what we learned is the following. At this point, the physical slavery in Egypt was over. When the Makos came, Jews no longer worked as slaves. The Egyptians were no longer standing over them with whips and beating them. That part of the shibud was over. In fact, the Jews now were being given gifts. The Jews were admired. The Jews had the greatest status in Egypt. And this is very important for understanding Yetzias Mitzrayim. Remember that our standard picture of Yetzias Mitzrayim is the idea of Jews being able to escape from the horrible slavery that they were in Egypt by leaving Egypt. Here, what we see from the Ramban and the Ksav Sofer is that the slavery had already stopped while they were in Egypt. Let's move on now to the Ksav Sofer's explanation of a very puzzling pasuk later on in the Parsha. The pasuk tells us, one second, sorry. This is describing the night of the first Seder, the night of Yetzias Mitzrayim. This is in Perek Yud Beis, pasuk Mem Beis. Leil shimurim hu laHashem, lotzion me'eretz Mitzrayim, hu alayla hazeh laHashem, shimurim l'chol b'nei Yisrael l'dorosam. A very confusing pasuk. This is a night of watching to Hashem, to take them out of Mitzrayim. This night, which is to Hashem, protected or watched or reserved for all Bnei Yisrael, for all generations. Very puzzling pasuk. Ksav Sofer, in his Parshas, it says in the beginning, Rashi v'Ramban nevochim b'Parshas pasuk hazeh. He said Rashi and the Ramban are somewhat perplexed in their commentary in explaining this pasuk. So now the Ksav Sofer is going to give us his explanation. Vanirli, what seems to me is, Ki be'emes heichel cherus hashibud ba'odayos misham. As we mentioned, as the Ksav Sofer mentioned earlier in the Parsha, the freedom from slavery started while the Jews were in Mitzrayim. Okay, so then why did they have to go? V'tachlis hayetziu misham lo haya ela kadei sheyetzu mitumas Mitzrayim lekabel haTorah. That the problem of the Jews in Egypt wasn't just the physical servitude, but it was the fact of the tumah, of the spiritual negativity of Mitzrayim that the Jews were immersed in. And they had to get out of that in order to receive the Torah. That was the journey they had to take. That was the step that they had to take to go over and out of the borders of Mitzrayim. They could not receive the Torah in Mitzrayim. They could not receive the Torah as they were in Mitzrayim without going through a separation and purification process. And in fact, he says this is the explanation of those Rishoim Shebador. Chazal tell us that they were Rishoim among Am Yisrael that didn't want to go out. And those were the ones who died during Makas Choshech. Now, according to the standard storyline that we follow, why would these Rishoim not want to go? If the Egyptians are enslaving you and beating you, and here you can go free, they said, no, Tov lanu b'Mitzrayim. We're doing okay now. We're fine in Mitzrayim. Not only are we no longer being enslaved, the Egyptians now like us. We are citizens like everybody else. And whatever you're promising to us to do, going out there to the Midbar, Tavdu nas Elokim al har hazeh, that's going to be a world of mitzvahs. That is going to be a world of obligation. We went from being Avdei Paro to being Avdei Hashem. These Jews said, fine, I'm happy not to be an Eved of Paro, but I really don't want to or need to be an Eved of Hashem. So this explains the Ksav Sofer is why we constantly remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's not just for the miracle aspect of it. It said we had many wondrous miracles that happened to us in the continuation of the Chumash, in the Nevi'im. We don't have this remembering of those things every single day, every occasion, etc. He says we remember this because this was the pivotal miracle, the pivotal shift, the pivotal Yetziah that enabled us to go and to receive the Torah. He says by stepping out of Mitzrayim, by following Hashem out of Mitzrayim to receive the Torah and to become Avdei Hashem, this was a unique event. And it was an event which wasn't running away from the physical suffering in Mitzrayim. It was from the spiritual negativity of Mitzrayim. It was wanting to separate from that and wanting to connect to Hashem in the most powerful way, which was Matan Torah. There was no other nes, he said, which brought about such a transformation. This is what is meant in the pasuk, that night, the night of the Seder, is Leil Shimurim Hu LaHashem Lotziam Me'eretz Mitzrayim. This was a night which is Shimurim, it's dedicated to only one thing, to take them out of Eretz Mitzrayim. Hu alayla hazeh Hashem, meaning to connect them to Hashem. It wasn't about slavery, non-slavery, citizenship, non-citizenship. On that night, it wasn't redeeming their physical safety and well-being. That was fine. It was already done. They were free from the slavery of Mitzrayim. And they were looked up to and admired by the Egyptians. This night is only dedicated to the idea of drawing close to Hashem and distancing ourselves from anything that would distance us from Him. L'shem Hashem, lasas ritzonu lavod avodoso yedei Yetzias me'eretz Mitzrayim. The process of leaving Mitzrayim is only framed in terms of coming to receive Hashem's Torah, getting close to Hashem, following Hashem. Hula laila hazel Hashem. That's why the pasuk emphasizes this night is to Hashem, levado v'lichvodo. That is the only focus of this night. Shimurim l'chol b'nei Yisrael, and it is set aside and protected for all of Am Yisrael. Even though we've had other nisim and miracles that have happened, nonetheless, this night is unique and set aside, and there's no other night like Leil HaSeder. L'dorosim, for all generations, because it's for Hashem. Lichvodo kavua. Right? This is the purpose of it. So now let's look at the story that we're really telling on Leil HaSeder. There's a problem that many people have tried to, make Pesach a very universal holiday. The holiday of freedom from servitude, of independence versus tyranny, and therefore it's a holiday for everyone. And there are many people that like to bring, groups from the local church to have a Passover celebration together, etc. Leil HaSeder, Pesach, is exclusively a story of the Jewish people. It's true. We do not like tyranny. We do not like racism, cruelty, any of those things. But that isn't the story that's happening here. The story that we're telling is the story of Jews running after their identity, deciding who they want to be, even if the conditions are fine, heading off into the unknown, as long as that is where Hashem wants them to be. Zacharti lo chesed nurayich, it says in Navi. Hashem says, I remember the loving kindness of your youth. Avas klulosayich, the love like the newly married. Lechtech acharai bamidbar beretz lo zarua, to go after me into the desert, a place where nothing is planted and growing. That is the love that HaKadosh Baruch Hu remembers of Am Yisrael, and that was the great step that the Jews took to step out of Mitzrayim under those conditions. We would think, of course they left Mitzrayim. If they were able to, so they would go. Who wants to stay for a life of torture and slavery? But now we discover that life of torture and slavery was over. It was a very different and very pleasant life that was waiting for them now if they stayed in Egypt. So here we can perhaps understand what we say in the Haggadah. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu had not taken our forefathers out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, we and our children and our children's children would have still been enslaved to Paro in Mitzrayim. Why to Paro in Mitzrayim? What it means is we would have been enslaved to the spiritual negativity, the tumah of Mitzrayim. Had we stayed, we would have been part of that. We would not have received any identity that would have taken us out of there. We would not have had the Torah. That's why it's such a pivotal night that's so real and relevant for each and every one of us at every time. Let's look at a couple other things about this that I discovered. The Lubavitcher Rebbe in his Likutei Sichos speaks about this idea of the Jews who were Rishoyim and didn't want to leave Mitzrayim, who died in the day, during the days of Choshech, of darkness. So he said, in Golus Mitzrayim, there were many Rishoyim. There were even Ovdei Avodah Zarah. There were those who served idolatry. As the Medrash says, that when the Jewish people came to Yam Suf, the Yam Suf rebelled against splitting for the Jews and drowning the Mitzrayim. It said, Halalu of the Avodah Zarah, Halalu of the Avodah Zarah. These serve idols, and those serve idols. Chazal tell us the story of the pesel of Micha. Micha had an idolatry that he brought with him, and that later played a part in the history of Am Yisrael and became a great problem. So, who were the ones who got to go out of Mitzrayim, even though they were ashamed, even though they served idolatry? And who were the ones who stayed? So he says we can explain this by comparing it to the power of Yom Kippur. He says, according to the Shita of Rebbe in Maseches Yoma, Yom Kippur brings atonement for all mitzvahs in the Torah, all averos that are done, whether the person did tshuva or whether the person didn't do tshuva. Yom Kippurim mechaper, Yom Kippur atones. But there's one condition for a person to get that. Moder Rebbe b'koris tiyoma. Rebbe agrees that if a person is transgressing the very laws of Yom Kippur on Yom Kippur, then they're not able to benefit from that atonement. The reason is because the way Yom Kippur is mechaper on the wrongdoings that we've done is because on Yom Kippur, the deep inner connection of Am Yisrael and Hashem is revealed. It is a connection which goes beyond and is not dependent on our behavior, on our spiritual state. But if a person is actually transgressing the laws of Yom Kippur itself on Yom Kippur, so then he's, so to speak, rejecting that connection which is revealed. He's not being part of it, and therefore that cannot help him. So too here, the Jews being taken out of Mitzrayim was not dependent on their spiritual state. That's one of the most important things we have to remember about Yetzias Mitzrayim. But it was Hashem revealing the deep connection that he had with Am Yisrael, that we are his. B'ni b'chari Yisrael. Yisrael is my firstborn son, that our destiny is with him. So therefore, that was what redeemed us, and even the Rishayim among Bnei Yisrael, when they saw that, they had not yet detached themselves from idolatry and such. They were able to go out. They had a desire to go and to follow Hashem with this. Even more so, right? There were some who were reluctant to leave, right? You can see in the Mefarshim also, when it gets to Kriyas Yam Suf, where the Jewish people seem to be flipping back and forth and saying contradictory things. I believe it's the Ramban who says that there were different groups among Am Yisrael. And so too here also, there were Jews who believed in this connection with Hashem, but nonetheless, it was necessary for Paro to chase them out. Kala garish yigarishosam. So he explains, these were Jews, again, who wanted to go, they were just afraid to go. They also had the schus, had the merit to be taken out of Mitzrayim. Hashem had Paro give them that push to get them out. But those people who opposed Yetzias Mitzrayim itself, and now from the Ramban and the Ksav Sofer, we can see who, what, and why those people were, because they felt there was no reason to go. They had the best of both worlds. They were sitting pretty in Mitzrayim. This unknown world of obligation and servitude to Hashem was something they didn't want and didn't need. So those were the ones who stayed, and those are the ones who disappeared. And we all would have disappeared had we not come out that way. So this is the story that happens every year on Pesach. This is why it's so important for us to remember this night and to understand the true story of what's going on, and to be able to share that and transmit it to other people. The excitement of Pesach, of Yetzias Mitzrayim, is that not of running away from physical suffering, running away from physical danger, but running towards Hashem and running towards our destiny. Rav Hutner Zatzal in his Pachad Yitzchak on Pesach speaks about the theme of chipazon, of speed and energy that's there in the Yetzias Mitzrayim process. The Korban Pesach was eaten b'chipazon, right? They left b'chipazon. There was an idea of running after Hashem. In Shir Hashirim, the pasuk Moshcheni acharecha norutza means Rashi explains, if you give me a hint by sending Moshe and Aaron to pull me, we will run after you. We find that also in the world of the matzahs. The pasuk that we have in the Parsha about preparing the matzahs, Ushmartem es hamatzahs. You must guard the matzahs. What is that? So when you harvest the wheat, you have to be careful that it doesn't get wet, because that could cause the chimutz, the leavening process, to start. So we guard the wheat, preferably, right? And that is what we call matzah shmura, that we use certainly at the Seder, is shmura mishas katsira, that has been protected and watched over from the time that it was harvested. The regular matzah can be shmura mishas techina, from the time of grinding the flour, which is when it's extremely susceptible to contact with water, bringing about the chimutz, the leavening process. But Chazal say a drasha on that. It says, Ushmartem es hamatzos. The word matzos looks just like the word mitzvahs. And they say, from here we learn mitzvah haba liyodcha al tachmitzena. If a mitzvah comes to your hands, don't let it become chametz. So the Maharal asks, why would you compare a mitzvah that you let become chametz, meaning you tarried, you delayed, you were slow with it, and it becomes chametz? That can happen if we're working with the dough making matzahs and we aren't as speedy and energetic as we should with it, then it can become chametz. But here, the scenario is a person did a mitzvah. He looks out the window, he sees an old lady struggling, bringing her shopping home, and he says, oh, it would be a great mitzvah to help her. But he just made a cup of coffee, which would get cold. So he says, I'll drink my coffee. She's moving fairly slowly. I'll catch up with her and I'll help her with her things. And he does. So the Maharal is basically asking, why would you compare that to chametz? Chametz on Pesach is the worst of the worst. Here a person did a mitzvah. He didn't do it in the best way possible. He didn't do it with zrizus, with energy and speed. So instead of giving him an A for the mitzvah, give him a B. Instead of a 90, give him an 80. Why are you calling it chametz? Maharal gives a very cryptic answer. He says it's because that Jew is treating a mitzvah like something which is tachas hazman, which is under time. What does that mean? So Rav Hutner in the Pachad Yitzchak comes to explain the Maharal. He says that there are two sources for a person displaying zrizus, energy and speed in what they're doing. One is a result of pressure. If you are racing to catch your plane and you got to the airport late, so you're running, there's pressure, financial loss, missing your meetings, whatever it'll be if you miss that plane. But there's another type of energy in running that you can see also in airports. When somebody lands after having been away for a long time and some loved ones came to greet him in the airport, you'll see them running to each other. And a very cynical person standing on the side would say, why are you running? They came to pick you up. Take your suitcases and go to the car. What is that? Running to each other happening. He says that is not something that comes from time pressure. That is the rebellion of the soul, of the nefesh, against any distance of space and time that separates me from that which I want to be united with. That is the zrizus that's there in Mitzrayim. The zrizus of Am Yisrael was not running away from the Mitzrayim, but running towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was rebelling against anything which would separate us from Hashem. So we went out into the desert. We went out, and we didn't even prepare food, a very non-Jewish thing to do before a trip. And that was that beginning that we have to return to every year. Perhaps, I believe this may be the explanation for why the gates of Chumrah, so to speak, are opened on Pesach. It's always important to know what the basic halacha is. I heard this from Rav Zev Lev Shlita. What's a kula? What's a leniency? What's a chumrah? What's a stringency? And there are times and places for each. On Pesach, it seems like the gates of chumrah are opened, and while you shouldn't be grabbing chumrah's stringencies from other communities, but every community has stringency upon stringency upon stringency on Pesach. That's because Pesach is not just a day of fulfilling the letter of the law, but it's a time of love. And if the loved one tells you, I don't want you to have this in the house, you go around with bleach and fire and blowtorches and who knows what to get any of it out. If the beloved wants you to eat something called matzah at a certain time, you don't just take one little bite, but you eat it as it should be, with great energy and enthusiasm. That's the story of Pesach. To this day, and Sfarim point out that this is something very deep, it's not just a sociological phenomenon. Jews around the world, no matter what their background, almost invariably want to be at some type of Seder. You can see that the different Chabad houses around the world are swamped with people that come out of nowhere to want to be there at the Seder. And there's something deep in the Jewish soul that knows that that is Leil Shimurim Hu. That is a night which is La Hashem. That is the night of creating that bond with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of leaving Mitzrayim and attaining my identity. That is what we all depend upon. And Jews want to know the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And unfortunately, I believe we tell the wrong story. We tell the story of the physical oppression, which indeed was part of it and is described in the Torah and the Midrashim of Chazal. But the story of what's happening on the night of the Seder is entirely different. It's a story of slaves who were freed, not just freed, but slaves whose status had come up, whose ability to live in Egypt would be comfortable. And the story of leaving the culture of Mitzrayim, leaving the Tumah of Mitzrayim, in order to attain our true identity, follow our true destiny, and do that by walking out on that Leil Shimurim L'Hashem. We need to do this every year, in every Mitzrayim that we find ourselves, whether national or personal. Let's try, after learning this, to tell the right story to ourselves and to any of those who we have the opportunity to share it with, whether at the Seder or before and after. Have a wonderful Shabbos.